All right, dynamic range compression. This is session one, and we're going to talk about what is compression and how does it work. And then we're going to take a minute and look at an outboard compressor, and I want to also then compare that to what that looks like with our digital audio workstation compressor plugin counterparts. So we've got a lot of work to do. Let's go ahead and get started with our question. And we first want to ask, what is compression and how does it work? Okay. And let me just say right off the bat, to make this simple, compression is the process of making your audio quieter. Now, you might be thinking right off the bat, well, wait a minute, Dave, that doesn't make sense. I want my money back. You don't seem to know what you're talking about. Well, let me explain, because how does it work really helps us answer why does it make your audio quieter. Compression works by bringing down the peak volume of your audio and bringing those peaks closer to the valleys or the quieter spots of your audio. And so if you've ever been told, man, if you want louder tracks, you need to compress them. If you just want more punchier tracks, compress them more in your face. That's absolutely true. But the reason that is true is because when we properly use compression, we're taking the peak value of that audio and we're bringing it down closer to the valleys or the lower spots of that audio. That allows us to then bring the entire track back up, and that's where we get our perceived increase in volume. Whereas before, if we were to not compress the track and try and bring that volume up, those peaks would simply clip out the track. But if we compress those peaks, they're much closer to the quieter spot, and now when we bring the whole thing up, the quieter spots are louder and the peak spots are much closer. So we still have a dynamic, but it's much like if you envision compressing a spring. The dynamic is still there, but the outsides are closer to the center. That's much in the same way that compression works. And so it really is the process of making audio quieter, and it works by bringing down the peak volume of your audio, allowing you to then bring up the entire track to get that perceived increase in volume. So how does this work? I want to take a look at a waveform here. And if you're not familiar with this, let me explain what you're looking at. This is a stereo waveform. This was exported from a track I recorded that was a vocal line, just a short little vocal line. You can see there's some blank spots in here and of where there was no audio whatsoever from this being a vocal line. And let me explain exactly what you're looking at. Maybe you're not familiar with what a waveform is. Now we're zoomed out quite a bit, and so these in this view appear to be lines. It's actually kind of a wavy line. It's an actual wave file, and so this is showing that wave, representing what that wave would look like. But because we're looking at kind of a zoomed out view, it appears to be just straight up and down lines, and so that's fine for this demonstration here. But what you're looking at, you see right here, we've got a left channel and a right channel. This is a stereo track. And right through both of those channels, you see this line right here. That line is representing where our volume is basically non-existent, okay? So that's the complete silent sections of our audio. The vertical lines that appear vertical in this diagram, in this wave, right now are going up and down, and the taller the line, the louder the audio, okay? And so we can see that there's a good amount of dynamic from quiet to loud by all the different lengths of these lines as they appear in this wave. You can look at the same on the right channel as well. And these quiet spots are simply spots where, as I recorded this vocal, I waited for the music to go. I think this was a verse and a chorus. And so, and then in between there, you can see some spots louder, some spots quieter. So how would this work if we compressed this audio file? Let's take a look at the same waveform, only having been compressed. Okay, now if you look at these peak values, everything is much, much more closer to the quieter spots. We've got a big difference between this one here. Let's look at it again. Look at these peak values. These are the loud spots in the audio. So we've got a lot of dynamic from one to another. And if you look across here, it's, this one right here is very loud. This one right here is not quite as loud, but we've got quite a bit of variance from the peak spots of our audio. If we look at the compressed track, those peaks are much, much closer together, and they're much closer to the quieter spots. So we've got a lot less difference in our quieter parts of the audio compared to the louder spots, and the louder spots are much more closer to one another. This is what compression is doing, okay? Let's take a look at these same wave files, but let's look at them just in these wave diagrams side by side so you can see a little more of a difference. So over here on the left, this is the uncompressed file. Over on the right, this is a compressed file. So we've got definitely a lot more control. We still have dynamics, okay? We still have our up and down volume, so nice dynamic created, but that dynamic, as opposed to the uncompressed file, is much more controlled. And when I originally compressed this file, it was much quieter than this guy here on the left. And so what I ended up having to do is once it was compressed, just as I said, I was able to now renormalize that track. And in this case, the track on the right, I normalized to -3. And what that did is that looked at the loudest peak, which is this guy right here, and it brought that up to -3 dB. So if you were to look at this on a decibel meter, the loudest point right here, which is this guy right here, which is kind of a scraggler, it would peak at -3. And I think probably the reason we have this is this was an audio track, and so the compression was not quite as aggressive as maybe what you would use on a snare drum or something that was a lot more high energy. And so in other waveforms, if you were to compress them, really strong compression, you would have almost no variance with the peaks. They would all simply hit at basically the same place, depending on where your compressor was set. Now, there's really a couple different ways for that compression that it can work. One is just flat out looking at the peak values, okay? And so it just looks at the top end of that value. Another, maybe you've heard this term, the RMS. RMS stands for root mean square, and it's basically a mathematical term. But essentially, what RMS peak values are doing is RMS compression is having kind of an average of those peak values and how much it's pulling them down. And so, but in the end, we're getting a very similar result in that we're taking our peaks and we're bringing them much closer to the valleys, and definitely much more control while still maintaining a dynamic. So another thing that is very helpful as we look at how does compression work, I want to take a second and look at an outboard compressor. This is one of the DBX compressors. This is a screenshot of my 266 XL. This is a rack-mounted compressor. Now, I have two of these in a transporting rig that I use. I use that out when I do shows and stuff out, as well as I have it in my recording gear as well. And so use these kind of along with the preamps that are in my Allen & Heath Z14. Let me just let you take a look at the screenshot here. This is a 2-channel compressor, rackable unit, and we're looking at the the channel on the right. And I want to talk just for a minute about what these controls do. And it's important to understand the reason we're doing this is that it can be very helpful to understand in the virtual world what we're trying to emulate and what we're trying to produce from the real world. Knowing that our plugins are giving us the core of what you would see in an analog compressor or an outboard compressor, and they're just typically giving us at least that, but many times adding more to it. So it can be very helpful to understand what's going on in an outboard unit, because we can apply these controls in many of these settings to our plug-in compressors. So that's what I want to take a moment to do here. Let me just say right here, right off the bat, this guy has an expander gate function. Now, this is not the case with every compressor. Many compressors, particularly plug-in units, have the expansion and gate is a total separate plug-in. And many times compression is just by itself. That's completely okay. This unit has it together. It's very helpful to have that in an outboard unit for many different reasons. And I won't spend a lot of time on this right now because we're going to cover this in a later session. But expansion and gate is basically the ability to, it can be used to kind of take out that background noise or that background hiss. It basically turns off the channel. Expansion is, it does that a little more less aggressively, kind of like a balloon expanding. It's more of a soft on-off of the channel, and gating is more of a hard on-off, much like if you had a gate in a fencing in your yard, it's just open, close. And so the difference between expansion and gating has to do with how aggressive is it going to turn that channel on and off. And it does that based upon the audio signal coming in with, it has to do with this threshold value, which I'll explain in just a minute. And so, again, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time in this session about expansion and gate. We'll cover that in the future. But let's go ahead and take a look at the rest of what is available in this compressor. This guy right here, this threshold, same as this threshold over here, they both do identical things It's just the processing that happens after the threshold kicks in is different. In this case, it is the threshold is related to the expander gate. In this case over here, our threshold is all about the compressor. So what is the threshold? The threshold in this place on the compressor is the decibel level at which point compression will be applied. When audio comes into this compressor, wherever this threshold is set, when the signal goes above that threshold, that is the audio that then has compression applied to it. Whatever audio signal is below the threshold is simply unchanged by the compression settings. Now, the only exception to this rule is over here we have an output gain. The output gain is adjusting all of the signal that goes in, uncompressed or compressed, and it's giving a boost or a cut to that signal, and it really doesn't matter if it's compressed or not. Now, we have an option to use this as a makeup gain, which I'll mention in a moment, but output gain does affect all the audio that is both above and below the threshold. When it comes to our compression settings, the compression settings are only applied to the audio that is loud enough to go above this threshold level wherever that is set. So very important to understand. In this case, it has a 0 and a plus and a minus, and it's showing us what audio is below that threshold, and then when the audio extends above it, it hits that plus and then kicks in into the actual compression settings that we have applied here. Now, the next thing we see on this compressor is a ratio button. This ratio knob right here is also something that is typical for every compressor, whether it's a plug-in or not. And as far as the adjustments on it, sometimes they have just an amount, but here's what the ratio, an amount setting, but here's what the ratio is doing. The ratio is telling us exactly that the amount of compression we are applying to the audio that is extended above the threshold level. So in this case, it's set 2 to 1. A simple way to think about this is for every 1 decibel that comes into this unit that extends above, that's loud enough to go above the threshold, is being decreased by 2 decibels. So for every 1 decibel that comes in, we're losing 2 decibels of volume. And we're only losing that volume or that decrease of the peak values of the audio that is loud enough to go above our threshold. In this case, whatever audio is louder than negative 10 dB would be compressed 2 to 1. That's what our ratio is. Now, in between this, you see this little button right here that is called over easy. Now, the over easy value is identical to another value that you may have seen on your plugin, and that is called the knee value. There's really 2 opposite ends of the knee value. One is hard knee, the other is soft knee. Hard knee has to do with how aggressively are our ratio settings going to be applied to the audio that extends above the threshold. Soft knee is a much less aggressive application of that ratio of compression to the audio that is above the threshold. This over easy button is basically another way of saying hard knee, soft knee. It's kind of a preset value. When you push it in, it is compressing in a hard knee or in a soft knee way. When it's out and depressed, then it's compressing in hard knee. Hard knee is great for things like snare and things that you have a lot of high energy with. You want to capture kind of a quick attack. Soft knee can be very helpful for more of a softer vocal. And so, but this value right here, the over easy value, is the same thing as a knee value that you may have in your actual DAW plugin, okay? And you may have an over easy value as well, but they both mean the same thing. So as we continue on, we have 2 other options here in this compressor: the attack and the release. Now, what is the attack? The attack is very simply how fast or how slow is this audio going to be compressed that extends above the threshold. How fast or how slow are the ratio settings that we have set going to be applied to the audio that extends above the threshold? The release is, as you can imagine, mostly the exact opposite. The release is how fast or how slow is that audio going to be returned to its original value before it extended the threshold, okay? Now, these are typically millisecond values, and so even though a millisecond, anywhere from 0 to, several hundred milliseconds, okay? Even though you might think, well, it's just milliseconds, well, it really does have a huge effect on your audio. And so these settings allow you to adjust. Really fast attack would be great for, snare drum catching that initial attack of that pop. Sometimes You might want maybe more of a slower attack for like a vocal or something. Maybe you've got a bass guitar and you want to create a little more sustain. Sometimes having a medium attack but more of a slow release can create a more sustain to synth or bass guitar or even electric guitar. So we've got a lot of options just simply by adjusting the attack and the release. The attack is the speed at which our compression settings will be applied, and the release is the speed at which those settings will then be returned to their original value of the audio that was extended below the threshold. Okay. Now up here we see this gain reduction option. This is giving us the ability to have a visual meter of how much compression is occurring to the audio that extends above the threshold. Very helpful. As this ratio is set 2 to 1 and we can play with this threshold, the lower that threshold, the more audio reduction we're going to get, or gain reduction, and this gain reduction meter is going to give us a display of that. Is it 1 decibel, 3, 6, 10? Very helpful. And just quickly, as I mentioned, back to our attack and release, you'll notice this compressor has an auto button. The auto button is on the DBX unit here, allows the attack and release to be set based upon a predetermined value as it's processing the audio signal coming in, and it's determining a automatic attack and release. In this unit, it's very helpful. It's kind of a quick way to get up and running, and then sometimes you want the ability to depress that and then manually adjust these settings. And so, but that's what that button is for. Now, the last thing that we kind of talked about a little bit already is the output gain. And the output gain, here's where that comes in handy, really. When we compress our audio, let's just say we have this guy at 4 to 1. For every 1 dB that comes in, 4 dB are being knocked down, okay, to our ratio. We've got our to the audio that extends above that threshold. Well, when that happens, we're losing volume, okay? As I said, compression is about controlling or pushing down the volume of those peaks. And so when we lose that volume, this output gain is giving us the ability, sometimes this is called makeup gain. It's giving us the ability to make up the loss in our volume or our gain that we lost when we compressed it. And so very helpful. It allows us to bring that signal back up or bring those quieter spots back up, now having the top end or the peak values pushed down so that we avoid clipping. We can bring the whole signal back up to our original volume, and that's where we get our perceived increase in volume. Okay. Quickly, let me just take a look at the back of this unit here, and I want to point out one thing. This is pretty typical for any unit. We've got our 1/4 inch ins and outs, XLR ins and outs, and this unit has a +4 or a -10 pad. That's basically helpful if you're using this on an insert for drums. You may want the -10. If you're things with real high energy, you might want to be able to cut that signal so it doesn't clip. The +4 is great for softer things, vocals, synth, whatever. I want to draw attention just to this little guy right here. We'll talk about this more in a later session, but Sidechain Insert. This compressor has a sidechain insert, and many outboard units do, but the same is true with plugins. Many plugins have a sidechain option, and I'll just briefly mention that what this is giving us the ability to do is there's really a lot of things that we can do with it. One of them we could use to send that signal out of this compressor into, say, an EQ, and we could adjust some frequencies maybe for de-essing and then return the signal again. The other option that we could use this for is for a sensitivity to at what point is compression going to be applied to audio below the threshold. Sometimes this is used for several purposes, one being ducking. You may hear a radio talk show host where every time he talks, the music goes underneath him. Well, you could use a sidechain insert to do that very same thing by compressing the music with the compressor, and then using the sidechain input, taking an output from that vocal, and every time that vocal talks or causes noise dB to go into this input sidechain, what it's doing is it's saying, okay, every time I hear sound, I'm going to then apply the compression settings to whatever I'm compressing. And if that's confusing to you, don't worry about it. We'll cover sidechaining in another session. But there's a lot of uses for sidechain option, but I did want to point that out as this also is available in the DBX outboard unit and many outboard units as well. Okay, that's kind of a general rundown. From here, I want to take a look at what do our compressions now look like in our audio workstations, our digital audio workstations. How can we maybe have some comparisons to the real life processing that happens in an outboard compressor? Now let's take a look at compressor plugins in our digital audio workstations.